I'm going to be talking about microgrids today. And I wanted to touch on this because I feel like it's another piece of the puzzle to moving toward a future that is less dependent, or it has more dependence on renewables in the mix, and more social equity with power availability. So what is a microgrid? It's not very hard. It is kind of just like a small grid. It has interconnected loads like buildings, distributed generation, a local controller, and clear electrical boundaries that allow it to operate connected to the grid or in island mode, disconnected from the grid. A distributed generator can be any variety of technologies, so it can be something as simple as a diesel generator, like a lot of buildings already have, any number of renewables. It just needs to be decentralized from the grid, and typically it's close to the source that's using the electricity. That's different from how we do things now, at least in the US, because we have a vast power grid. What happens is we have central power plants that produce electricity, and they travel over high voltage power lines, hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles to the end user. Some fun facts, more fun facts. There are 9,200 generating units in the US, 1 million megawatts of power available, and over 600,000 miles of transmission lines. So that's kind of what this blue is, like a giant spider web of transmission lines. We have pretty reliable power, not me this morning, but in the US we do. One problem that we do have, though, is that our infrastructure is aging and there are increased number of power outages. One famous example was the 2003 Northeast blackout, which I learned about in 2003 because I was watching MTV's Rich Girls with Ali Hilfiger. And another problem is that our existing grid isn't well equipped to transition to having more renewables in our power mix. We need to have exactly enough power generated as we're consuming at exactly that time. And renewables fluctuate, so they make that hard. One way that we could deal with that is battery storage. So you could power up a battery when wind or solar is available and then let it out when it's not. But our grid is so big that we haven't been able to develop batteries big enough to handle our storage needs. That's where a microgrid comes in. So it's another possible solution of handling those two big issues. One way it helps is that it allows you to integrate distributed and renewable energy resources into the grid. And because of the variety of resources that it has, it makes the viability of using renewables more of an option. An example of a place where they are currently using a lot of renewables is the Isle of Egg in Scotland. They used to use primarily diesel generators, which burn pretty dirty. And then a few years ago, they transitioned to a microgrid with most renewables. Here's their hydro generator shed, which I really liked. Another example is in Japan, the Sendai microgrid, and this is internet famous, I found out, because during the 2011 earthquake in Japan, after 2 hours of blackout, this microgrid, which was more like a pilot microgrid, was able to come online and serve a teaching hospital on the university campus for 2 days. My confession is, even though they're so great, I have a hard time seeing microgrids become a really big part of our infrastructure in the very near future in the US. They have good applications like for power reliability at hospitals, data centers, but I think we're a long way just because of how we're set up. But where I do think they have good potential is for rural electrification, particularly in places all over the world that are currently without power. And the UN Foundation agrees with me. So here are some facts that are not as fun. 1.2 billion people worldwide, that's 16% of the world population, are without power, and 80% of those people live in rural areas right now. Almost 600 million of those people live in Africa, and more specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, and 300 million of them live in India, and that's like almost a third of their population. When people are without power and without access to modern ways to generate power, it's hard to break out of the poverty cycle. And so when electricity is brought into places that are without, it has benefits like better healthcare, lighting availability, and water purification. In Senegal, this village they used to have to walk like 10 kilometers to get electricity that was 1,000 times more expensive than we pay here to charge cell phones. Now they have a microgrid, and it's 1% of that cost. In India, in the Haryana state, they put in a microgrid that is combined with a reverse osmosis water filtration system. So where they used to have to walk long distances to get clean water, now this can produce water for 1,000 homes a day, and students get free water. In Tokelau, which is an atoll, which I learned a new word, in the South Pacific, they used to use also primarily diesel generators, but they installed a microgrid with 4,000 solar panels and 1,000 batteries for a 1 megawatt solar power plant, and they reduced their cost by $800,000 a year. In Puerto Rico, microgrids are becoming more common after Hurricane Maria. Something interesting that I saw is that farmers don't often have solidified land ownership, and so it's hard to get FEMA funding, and so a microgrid would help be independent if another disaster would happen. And my last fun fact, I studied abroad in Greece, and my professor, George Papadakis, had a summer house at an island, Kithnos, that had a microgrid. I decided I didn't want to do that, and I went with 2 other people to Meteora that has really cool rock formations, and it was great. Part of the reason I went there is because it was in a James Bond movie, and I couldn't have missed it, but now I regret it.